what the vaccine enables people to go along with more easily is the idea of a health passport or vaccine passport. And that passport becomes a gateway to a digital ID that's connected to your ability to participate in society. So it is the beginning of a social credit system. It is the back door into a social credit system.
You're going to need to have some way to prove you're vaccinated if we're going to have freedom to travel. So the biggest reason to get a vaccine passport going is many countries are saying you can't come in here unless you're vaccinated.
Welcome to episode 130 of the Mikhaila Peterson podcast. In this episode of Opposing Views, I had Arthur Caplan and James Lindsay on to discuss COVID-19 vaccine passports. We covered topics like the passport proposals themselves, current restrictions in different U.S. states, the potential impact of amplifying governmental control, and social credit systems. James Lindsay, my first guest, is an American author, cultural critic, and mathematician who's spent a significant amount of time in woke culture, especially among writers or in the written community. He had the opportunity to study, you could say, the main tenets of their literature and to gain a broader perspective on social changes, both in the US and worldwide. Arthur Caplan is a professor and founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. His focus is on research in bioethics, transplantation, and health reform. So these topics are right up his alley. You'll see. He had a very different perspective on what's behind vaccine passports. So make sure you stick around long enough to see that contrast. It's really interesting. And do remember to hit subscribe if you enjoy this episode or the Opposing Views format or want to see more.
James Lindsay, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This should be a good one. Before we get started, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
That's a mysterious topic. It's harder than you think to give a brief background of who I am and what I do. I have a PhD in math, and before that, I got a degree in physics. So my background educationally is in the sciences, the hard sciences, and mathematics. So lots of formal logic, etc. Lots of pattern recognition, that kind of thing. What mathematicians do, I guess. And through the course of the previous decade, I stumbled into this woke stuff happening, and I started to think that it was absurd. And so together with a colleague, Peter Boghossian, we decided that they were ripe for an academic hoax in 2016 and 17, which we wrote, and it was called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. We submitted that, and it was accepted by a very low-ranking, potentially predatory journal, probably predatory journal, called Cogent Social Sciences. It's really funny. It turns out it's maybe one of the funniest things I've ever written.
What was it called?
The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. So the argument was that penises don't really exist, but that they cause all the problems in the world, including climate change. And so we should think of them as a social construct that leads to machismo braggadocio in all men. And it's really lewd. It's a really horrifically lewd piece of academic writing. And we sent it to a journal that did not accept it. And then they forwarded it internally to what amounts to a predatory journal under the same publishing company. And so there was a scandal there, but we picked at the wrong scandal and said that we had pulled a satire on gender studies and made a big hay out of that. And we got a lot of criticism. And we took that criticism seriously, both friendly criticism and not so friendly criticism. In fact, vile criticism. We just took that as we didn't take it personally. We just took it as a roadmap. So, if we wanted to prove our point about gender studies and woke scholarship in general, that's what we have to do to satisfy the other side. They told us what it would take. So let's do that. So then we spent all of 2017 and 18 writing 20 more academic papers. The most famous of these is about that we can control rape culture by studying dog sex in the dog park and how people react to it. Those human reactions to queer performativity and canine rape culture in urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon was the title of that paper. And we concluded that we should train men the way that we train dogs. We rewrote a chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism that was accepted by a social work journal. We ended up getting 7 papers accepted, one of which, the dog sex paper, won an award for excellence in scholarship by the leading journal in the discipline. And we did that in the course of a little over a year. And at that point, we became international spokespeople for what in the world is going on in woke scholarship. So we figured, it was a crash course to do that. We didn't know woke scholarship well when we started, but obviously we got good enough where we could publish at the research level. So we knew a little bit by the time we were done with that project. So Peter diverted his energies into another project that he had on the back burner. And Helen Pluckrose and I, the other of our trio, set to really digging into the woke literature. And I'd keep describing it as saying, it's like if you bought a new property kind of out in the woods and you clean up the shed and you clean up this and you tidy up that and you fix the garden or you do whatever and you get the house in order. But there's been that tarp over something in the backyard and you've just left it to last. And you finally look under the tarp and you're like, whoop, dead bodies. And it was like finding dead bodies to the dead bodies rotting in the well, really poisoning our society, to see what was in the scholarship. And so I remember at that time saying, oh my gosh, this is like possibly civilizational collapse. Somebody has to do something about this. And so I actually quit my job and started studying this stuff full time, like I was attempting to independently do, PhD level research to understand. I'm reading papers and books, reading them multiple times, taking notes, trying to learn everything I can as fast as I can about the woke scholarship, the critical social justice scholarship. And I started a company at the beginning of 2020, kind of media and information, a media platform or something called New Discourses. It's at newdiscourses.com, where I basically take what I'm learning and put it out in the world as fast as I can publish it. So pardon the typos, I don't have time to edit. And so I'm trying to get this information out of the world as fast as possible. So my background is mathematician turned prankster, turned horrified by what I saw, turned probably I would say it's fair to say that I may be a leading, if not the leading scholar on most things woke literature, but especially critical race theory from outside of the umbrella of people who believe it. And I've been doing that full time ever since. And now I travel all over the place and tell people, not just putting it on the internet.
Okay. Wow. That was a wild story. I don't know, like whether to laugh or to cry or to be horrified.
I don't quite travel as much as your dad was, but it's a significant fraction.
Wow.
I've had nearly 80 flights this year, and that's with COVID and everything else. So I've been getting around.
Wow. Okay. Well, I brought you on this episode to talk about vaccine passports.
Can do.
Specifically. And I chose you because you've got a logical mind. I thought you'd show one side properly. Mm-hmm. So I think we should jump right in. That's pretty intense, though. That's pretty intense. Okay. So first off, starting with the mandatory vaccine passports that you see popping up everywhere. Mm-hmm. So my first question here is, according to you, is this vaccine mandate and these passports, is it the end of COVID or the beginning of something worse?
It's the beginning of something worse. The COVID's irrelevant to it. I mean, it's now the evidence has come out nearly incontrovertibly. It's just absolutely conclusive that there's what was a Harvard study that came out just last week, and it said that there's no statistical correlation of any meaningful stature between vaccination rates or vaccination percentages in different countries or states and rates of COVID. We see so-called breakthrough cases, all over the place. Natural immunity got completely ignored. They still want vaccines, even if you have negative tests. You get your vaccine, you still have to wear a mask. The mask doesn't do anything in the first place, almost. I mean, very, very little. And so it's all pretext. It's all pretext. But what a vaccine does, or not the vaccine itself, what the vaccine enables people to go along with more easily is the idea of a health passport or a vaccine passport. And that passport becomes a gateway to a digital ID that's connected to your ability to participate in society. So it is the beginning of a social credit system. It is the back door into a social credit system like what we see in China, which is effectively totalitarian under theirs. It is not to say that people in China can't live a relatively good life, but they are bound by this. They have to say the right things, not say the wrong things. They have to spend time with the right people, not spend time with the wrong people. They have to, do all these kinds of things to manage their social credit score, or they find that their ability to use their resources, their money or whatever, to take a trip or to get on a train or to get on a plane or whatever it happens to be, can be pretty severely curtailed. It can be very easily expanded to the point where, depending on your social credit score, things cost more or less for you. It can be a discount rate if you have a good propaganda score, because that's how you raise your social credit scores, behaving the way the government tells you to, and sometimes literally by watching propaganda videos on your device. And so if you participate in this, they can make it to where your groceries cost 50% less. And if you refuse to participate in this, or if you go against it, they might cost 50% more. And so they can really put a lot of social leverage on people. Also, they ban things like people getting together in large numbers unless it's government sanctioned and there's government representatives there watching it. It is the back door to something far worse. The vaccine itself, whether it's absolutely worthless, whether it's slightly valuable, whether it's extremely valuable, turns out to be irrelevant to this question. The vaccine is not going to end the pandemic, because the pandemic is being used to install social control. And the social control is being used basically to leverage people, those of whom have the vaccine. So they shrug their shoulders and say, well, I already have it, so I already have the vaccine, so whatever, to get the vaccine passport. The vaccine passport is designed to get people to start to participate in something digital in their phone that's connected to their ID, that controls their ability to participate in society, to buy and to sell, to go and to travel, to enter and to leave. You see, for example, in Ottawa in Canada and all over Australia, you can't leave unless you do all the things they tell you to. You get vaccinated and do all this other stuff. So it's just a backdoor to a total social control system, which will begin there. And if they can do it for whether or not you've taken an injection, they can start to do it for other things. It could be your body mass index. It could be whether or not you are, did you support the January 6th insurrection in some way online? Well, now you're a domestic terrorist. Are you a mother or a father showing up to a school board and complaining about what they're teaching? Well, now you're a domestic terrorist. And so if you have a digital passport system that can control your access to society, it's very easy to put a lot of pressure and leverage on those people. We are seeing the dawn of totalitarianism in the West, and the vaccine passport is the back door to it. And the vaccine itself, clearly, the data have come in, is not adequate to end the pandemic, as it were. And in fact, it's seeming to be that it may actually be making it worse. It's probably driving, if you understand biology, it's driving the variants. The variants may become worse or less bad depending on how evolutionary processes work. And in this case, antibody-dependent enhancement can make some very scary variants that may be coming down the pike. And so everything about this, it seems to be pretext. And the pretext is for what? Well, the passports. And the passports are for what? A backdoor to a social control system like we see in the model exists like we see in China.
Okay. So then what's your response to people that say that sounds like a very complicated conspiracy theory?
That it's already happening, that they've literally published that this is the intention. If you go to the World Economic Forum website, it's actually on there. There was a book written in, I think, in the 40s called The Open Conspiracy that suggests that you can get away with a gigantic, scary conspiracy if you just talk about it, because then people think, well, a conspiracy would be happening in secret behind closed doors. They wouldn't tell us that they must have some other intention. And so that's what I would say to that is it's out. It's not even hidden. The director of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, at the very beginning of the pandemic, uncannily quickly published a book called, by June of last year, published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset, where he explains that we have a very narrow window to reset the entire world and its economy and its approach to social management and everything through COVID-19. And that's not a conspiracy. That's actually an organization that's openly telling you what their goals are and why they're doing it. If they don't want to believe that, I guess that's on them, but I encourage them to go read it. This is the same thing so I'm famous with the woke literature, right? And I always, like, literally sitting here right next to me, I have a famous woke education book. Why? Because if you follow my podcast, Most of what I do on my podcast, I don't sit here and talk to this microphone and just pontificate. I read the woke literature to people and say what I think about it. And I always encourage people, listen, don't believe me. There's a great chance I'm wrong. I think most people are well-intended and kind of dumb. That includes really smart people. And so we make mistakes. We get things wrong. I encourage people then to go read it for themselves. I give people access to the degree that it's legal. I can't give people the books. I can't republish a book. But, I give people access. This is the book I took this from. Go read it yourself. See if you draw the same conclusion. Draw your own conclusion. Argue with me. Discuss with me, whatever it is. Same thing with this. Go read what Klaus Schwab has written about the fourth industrial revolution, what Klaus Schwab has written about COVID-19 and the Great Reset, what the World Economic Forum is doing, how all of this ends up aligning with the so-called Build Back Better program that we don't just hear from Joe Biden or from Justin Trudeau. Mm-hmm. We hear it from Boris Johnson. We hear it from an uncanny number of world leaders, all kind of in unison, all at once. You can actually read these things yourself. And if you want to disagree, that's fine. But I seriously encourage people to actually go read what's written first. And Klaus Schwab's books are not hard to read. They're just annoying because they're all kind of that empty corporate jargon, but they're not hard to read. I read The Great Reset and quote COVID-19, The Great Reset in something like, half a day or something. It's not a difficult book. And you can just see it. Go to his website, go to the World Economic Forum website and see what they're publishing. It's constantly like, you're going to eat bugs. You're going to live in a pod, all this weird, they put out a video in 2016. In fact, it said after the great, to advertise for the Great Reset, a video, it went viral and it said the first thing, coming by 2030 or whatever, what's the future going to look like? They said, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Everything you have will be rented. Western values will have been pushed beyond their breaking point. They literally list 6 or 8 points of just crazy stuff that people would say is a total conspiracy theory. I encourage people to just go engage with it. See what you think. Why did they put this? Ask the question simply. Be open. Why did they put this out? Why on earth are people they made a video not that long ago where they had a whole bunch of people in a room and it said the Great Reset, whatever. And it's got a picture of Joe Biden. It's got a picture of George W. Bush. It's got a picture of Ivanka Trump. Those are the people involved. What's going on? Just go look for yourself. Then watch the scary video that they tell you what they're talking about, what they're doing. Constantly warning about cyber. Schwab's been warned about the virus before there was a virus. He warned about cyber attacks before there were cyber attacks. He warned about supply chain disruptions before there were supply chain disruptions. If it's not a conspiracy, that's fine. But you should probably go look at it at least before you just dismiss it out of hand. These guys have been publishing this crap since the 70s, telling people what their plans are. So I encourage, what would I say to people who say that sounds like conspiracy theory? I would say, go read what they've written about it. Just go read in their own words, major organizations that are tied up with major corporations. Larry Fink of BlackRock is deeply embedded in this, for example, and see what's there. Just see.
That's horrifying. I regret doing this podcast so early in the morning. So do you think the reason that this is being, say this is true and this is being implemented, is the reason it's being implemented to keep people safe?
I mean, what do you mean by safe? I don't mean to be the philosopher in the room, but yes, their goal, their justification is through safety, because they believe, as the neo-Marxists pointed out, for example, Max Horkheimer pointed out, that freedom and justice, these being kind of key words, are dialectical concepts. That's what he said. They exist in contradiction. So that the more freedom that you have, the less justice that you have, and the more justice that you have, the more freedom the more justice, the less freedom, and back and forth. And so Max Horkheimer actually said this. He was the 3rd director of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He is the person who named critical theory. He invented the idea of critical theory out of Marx's critical philosophy. He said that he was correcting for some of the errors of Marx. One of Marx's errors, he said, was that freedom and justice are dialectical. And Marx thought that as you get more justice, you will get more freedom. And this is where you have to understand that justice means justice according to communist terms. So justice means communism. So what he's actually saying is that if you want, justice is going to contain safety. If you want to look at that, safety and freedom are in opposition to one another. And so to keep people safe or to exert social control are really, in some sense, part and parcel the same thing. It's just a matter of justifications. And so this is, like I said, that's 1969 when Horkheimer explained that in an interview. And he said his entire critical theory is based on that. So yes, the justification is to keep people safe, just like before the French Revolution, it was the Committee of Public Safety that did the Reign of Terror. It was to keep people safe. It was for their best interests. The technocrats or the aristocrats at the time, whoever it was going to keep everybody else safe on their terms. And that's what it really boils down to, is that they're going to keep people safe from themselves because they think that they're smarter than everybody and the little lords of the earth or whatever else, and that they're going to, tell people what it requires of them to be safe. It's not very safe, for example, if there's social unrest. So what do? You have to figure out ways to completely do kind of the socialist redistribution program, not just economically, but now in terms of power and privilege and access. We call that equity. And so now we're going to have worldwide equity programs that redistribute resources, power, privilege, et cetera, not just access to the means of production. And that will help stabilize things. Oh, well, if we're going to keep people safe, we have to keep them safe from these viruses. I just saw that Spain came out and said that it's not enough to wear masks for COVID. We have to continue to do this until we stamp out the flu now. So now we have to continue all of this medical tyranny because of the flu, which has obviously been a thing people have been living with for a very long time. And I saw another article just yesterday or the day before that said, we didn't just, take precautions against COVID. We basically stamped out the flu. They say that the flu didn't happen in 2020. They have documented, I think quite falsely, I have a personal reason for believing this, that there were some 2,000 cases of flu in the past year. Of course, the PCR tests that they were using at the number of cycles, the detection sensitivity that they were running it, can't really distinguish COVID from flu. And so how many so you have that issue. And then simultaneously, I got the flu. So this is what I don't understand. I just told you a minute ago that I travel all over the country, talking all over the place. I go to all these meetings, all these conferences. I'm in contact with hundreds or thousands of people regularly. Somehow it appears that despite there being millions upon millions upon millions and, oh my gosh, pandemic numbers of cases of COVID, I somehow managed not to get COVID with all of these huge public super spreader events or whatever that I went to. But there were only 2,000 cases of flu, but somehow I got the flu. That's weird. How did I get something literally that rare? And I actually thought I had COVID. So I went to the doctor and I got diagnosed. I had the flu. And so, they did the test and flu. So and it felt like flu and it acted like flu and it probably was flu. And so, what are they trying to keep us safe from? They're trying to keep us safe from everything. And of course, it's one of your dad's best messages is that you're always in this kind of trade-off between risks, right? It's one of the things I admire of his message the most is that there's a risk in trying to protect yourself and there's a risk in not trying to protect yourself if we're going to put it in this specific context. So if you don't protect yourself from flu, then you might get flu. You're taking that risk. But if you decide to protect yourself from flu or COVID or car accidents or whatever else, then you are going to take a different risk. And the risk that we take with regard to these things is destroying our livelihoods, destroying our economy, massive amounts of death by suicide from people who have been socially isolated for so long and feel like there's no way out, massive increases in substance abuse, overdose deaths, other deaths of despair. We see now, although you're not allowed to mention them, they apparently don't exist, vaccine injuries. The VAERS data is granted, it's not rigorously collected. It's anybody can go file a claim. So it's a quite open question of what's in there to some degree, but the VAERS data is concerning. And oddly enough, they're pretending that the VAERS data is not concerning. And so there's a trade-off of risks. And so they say it's about safety, but the question is, what are we trying to keep ourselves safe from? And what are we losing, or what are we paying with to buy that alleged safety? So maybe we do make ourselves safe from flu, but is it worth say all having to stay living in our own houses and borderline never being allowed to leave, and having to make sure that, stores don't really exist for us to go out into the public square and interact in person, because we can just order it on Amazon and have it delivered, which is to Amazon's great benefit, of course. What are we losing in order to buy that safety? And the thing is you always have to ask, where is that reasonable line? Where is the reasonable line? Where are you going to say, no, the risk is worth it? The risk to think for yourself, the risk to take your own action, the risk to get in a car, even though it's one of the most dangerous things most people do on a day-to-day basis, even though they don't think about it, the risk to get in a car and drive where you will under your own power. They can take that away in the name of safety as well. We could either just curtail how much people drive by making it very expensive through odd gasoline taxes or mileage taxes, like they're attempting in the United States. You could also transition to driverless cars. And so your car drives itself. Maybe it doesn't even have a steering wheel that you can control. They get the AI technology sufficiently good. Then what? Well, you get in your car and you say, well, I want to go to the grocery store, and you push it in there. And for some reason, they don't want you to go to the grocery store, and your car drives you to the police station instead, where you're questioned for something you put on Twitter. And you can't control your car because you don't have the freedom to control your car, because your car isn't driven by you. What are you trading? I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to happen. That's certainly possible. Even with these cyber attacks from Klaus Schwab, cyber attacks, they could cyber attack your car, drive you off a bridge. Somebody could hack your self-driving car and kill you. What are you trading in the name of safety? And what you're often trading is another kind of unsafety. You're putting a different risk into the equation, and people are not usually good unfortunately, at thinking through and balancing risks and saying some level of risk is always going to happen. So therefore, some level of risk always has to be acceptable. And that, in fact, what causes the most happiness and flourishment is to allow people to make the decisions for themselves about how much risk they're willing to take. For example, if you're afraid of COVID and you want to get the vaccine, and you want to wear 2 masks and a face shield and whatever else, and you want to dress in a garbage bag. I've seen somebody wearing PPE in public before, which is hilarious. Good. That's your decision. That's your decision. You want to have, or you never want to leave your house. I have a family member who left his house 9 times during the entire time from pandemic lockdown in March of 2020 until the vaccine was available to him in summer of 2021. So something like 14 months, he left his house.
Wow.
9 times. If that's what you think you need to feel safe, that's a decision you should be able to make. Of course, what was a trade-off? He lost all that opportunity, a year of his life, to spend time with friends, to connect, to get out, whatever mental health toll that took on him, I don't know. But there's a trade-off there. But if that's what you want to do to feel safe, that's your choice. And if you want to take a reasonable risk, that's also your choice. Of course, we do have laws like traffic laws to minimize certain types of risk because we have learned some lessons the hard way. But I think that there is a very open space for a lot of debate about what level of risk you allow people to think for themselves and choose for themselves and take, that's just getting swept off the table over a virus that is, even though it's imminently survivable, is routinely being compared to smallpox, which is not imminently survivable.
Okay. The vaccine passport that's being introduced, or that's here, do you know what differences it makes to people? So if you have the vaccine, what are you allowed to do? And does that differ by state? And if you're not vaccinated, what kind of freedoms are you losing?
Well, I mean, in the US, as far as I know, only the state of New York, and maybe mostly only New York City, and then Los Angeles are actually implementing these in practice so far. So like, I live in Tennessee. There are no COVID policies here that have any meaning as far as I'm concerned, or I'm aware. I never wear a mask anywhere except on airplanes and to go through security in an airport, nowhere else. And it's just not part of my life. Now, if I go to New York, they're very strict, and to get into places, you actually have to have the vaccine. And there it's down to individual enforcement. So we're not all the way, I know Canada's a little bit different, but we're not all the way at the level of passports. They've attempted it in New York City. I think they're about to attempt it in Los Angeles. And otherwise, the rest of the United States does not have that. But they do have these weird mandates in different employment sectors, some of which are more real than others. Joe Biden, for example, does have the authority to mandate that federal employees who are under his purview should be can be mandatorily vaccinated. He does not, however, have the authority to say that my private company, maybe named Amazon, can mandate. I don't own Amazon, just full disclosure, can mandate their employees to be vaccinated. So people think that, though, because of this whole, OSHA thing, but it turns out that was just a press release, and it's so far. And I know that because there are lawyers who've been waiting to sue the federal government for this mandate, and they can't sue because there's actually no official thing. They just did a press release and said that they're going to do it, and then companies started doing it, even though there's no legal apparatus requiring them to, which sort of sucks for those companies. Again, safety and trade-offs, right? Because those companies believe they're taking a move that lowers their liability, we'll presume, by getting people to get vaccinated, or requiring their employees to get vaccinated if they have more than 100 employees. But the legal apparatus that would take away their legal responsibility if something goes wrong was not actually put in place. So the companies are going to be left holding the back.
That was a press release?
Everything's fake. This is all fake. I hate to sound like a lunatic. There's so much of this. I mean, after having, again, we can go back to the woke literature. I invoked the critical theorists, and now I'm going to invoke the postmodernists. I'm going to invoke John Baudrillard, who talked about it through the 80s, about this idea of simulation, simulacrum, and hyper reality. And hyper reality is this kind of fake reality that's more real than real. It's a propaganda creation is what it is. And he was thinking largely, but not entirely. He was thinking largely at the time of, marketing, where you have the airbrushed model and she looks hotter than hot, and it's, whatever, she looks more feminine than female allows in reality, because she's airbrushed and she's, photoshopped into, put a little extra hip on her, slim that waist a little bit, let's make those eyes really like perfectly shine, or, more real than real. And so he was kind of thinking of that, but he also wrote a series of essays during the Gulf War that were collected into a book that's titled The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. And what he argues in that book is it's not that there weren't incidents, and in fact, atrocities that were taking place in the Middle East. It's that what we were presented with through CNN and the other media outlets and our governments was not what was really taking place. We were given the Truman Show version of a real thing that was happening in the Middle East. And the thing that is called the Gulf War was the production. That was his argument. So we're not looking at the real thing. We're looking at a fake creation around the real thing that drives a narrative. And he actually, in fact, said that when the Gulf War did not take place, he said the Gulf War is an atrocity masquerading as a war. And so this has been picked up. What's happened is the people who are in power right now, whether it's through the woke, or whether it's in conjunction with the woke, or whether it's the so-called regime or the overstate, or the whatever we might want to call the hyper elites who seem to be doing a bunch of weird stuff in many countries all at once, very simultaneously, to where everything seems to be happening at once, everywhere at once. They have seen the tools. In fact, they've seen the warnings that were given by both the critical theorists and the postmodernists especially, and said, these are weapons. And they've picked them up and they've started to use them. And so where Baudrillard was in despair, warning about the state of the world in which it's possible to create a hyper-real or a pseudo-real image of what's actually happening in the world, and to manicure and control that through propaganda and repetition and marketing, and because he hated capitalism, had to be marketing and everything else. You flip that over and you get the Truman Show, where if the basic plot is Jim Carrey's character Truman doesn't know that he's actually a character in a television show, where he lives in a town that's not even real. He's lived his entire life in a town that doesn't exist, because it's actually a sound stage. And at the end, he ends up on a boat and he crashes into the edge of the sound stage and finds out that his entire reality is fake. And then the audience watching is, has 30 years or 40 years, has fallen in love with this character outside of the Truman Show, this Truman. And are they aghast at the fact that it's all fake? and that they've been manipulating Truman and all that. No, they're just more enthralled with this, with the hyper real story being told. That's really kind of what we're dealing with. And so, the Biden administration comes out. It's just like when they did the extension on the eviction moratorium. Biden said, we don't have the authority to do this. We'll just do it anyway. It'll buy us time. And then it got overturned in court. So from COVID, they made an eviction moratorium where you couldn't evict people if they didn't pay their rent, say, to their landlord. The landlord had no legal response to throw them out. And so it was going to expire, I think, at the end of July, but it may have been June, but I'm pretty sure it's the end of July this year. It was set to expire. They let the clock run down to a crisis so that they could then come out and say, Congress never acted, blah, blah, blah. And then Biden came out with an executive order saying, well, we're going to extend this eviction moratorium, even though it's a legislative decision, not an executive decision. So he technically couldn't do it. And he said, we'll get the CDC to do it for us. So we'll use an administrative apparatus, which is under the executive branch, to do it. And so they extended it, but he even said it's unconstitutional. We know it's unconstitutional for us to do it, but it'll buy us time. It's all fake. It's all just manipulations. They're just completely creating a fabrication of what's really going on. And I actually think that we're in a very interesting time in history, very much like after the printing press was invented, the internet being our analog, in which the powers are realizing that the mechanisms by which they maintained power are literally being dissolved out from under them. And so now they're trying desperately to use those tools, whether through selective censorship, whether through threats of banning people from social media for saying the wrong things, for example, by trying to change definitions very rapidly, by putting things out that are just, as they say in professional wrestling, kayfabe, which is when it's fake and the audience knows it's fake, but you all pretend it's real anyway. They're doing this, I think, in a desperate attempt to maintain control. And if you look at that World Economic Forum stuff that I was telling people they should go read a minute ago through that lens, all of a sudden it kind of also makes sense. These super hyper elites realize their power is about to be swept out from under them. And by creating a state like you have in China, where there's total information control, you can keep that thing under a lid.
Okay. So I guess any skepticism I have towards, and I'm not that skeptical, but any skepticism I have towards something like this would be, I think the average person is not capable of doing very much. I don't think people are that bright. And this is huge. So how could people have come together to architect something or something this complicated and then have it be successful?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The answer is that they basically played upon the people who have the right access to power in the right ways. And in particular, because of, say, in the United States, and I know things are a little different in Canada, our Constitution makes it very difficult for these kinds of things to have been put into place. But the corporations can do a lot of things that the government can't. For example, Twitter can curtail your speech so far because they are a private company. And that's the argument you usually hear. So what actually happened was there was a collection of corporate leaders who were brought together. That's what the World Economic Forum is, who met in this Davos, Switzerland, and they came together and they had all of these visions for how they could shape society and go forward. But more importantly, the large banking institutions started to bake into their programs things that would make sure that that's how capitalism or business plays out. So, for example, all of the big leading lenders and asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, et cetera, all require adherence to what they would call environmental, social, and governance measurements, ESG metrics. And ESG metrics are defined in terms of sustainable development goals. So the goal is to make a sustainable world, which sounds great on paper until you realize that it means a heavily managed and administered economy by a technocratic oligarchy, in other words, socialism. In a new form. Neo-socialism is a better way to phrase it, because it's not old school socialism. It's something completely different. And so if you want to have your assets managed or to do business with one of those major lenders or even through a central bank, you better have a proper ESG score. So there's been, in effect, a social credit score already put into place for these big companies. And the model they were sold was that corporations have lost their way. They're no longer being socially responsible, so that we have to have responsible governance models put into place. And we're going to shift a little bit at first out of this idea that the corporation's primary obligation is to its shareholders, which are the people who own stakes in the company, into something broader called stakeholders, which involve all of these people who are, say, technocrats who say, you know what, we have a stake in what your ExxonMobil does, and with regard to pollution, with regard to environmental controls, we, the people of whoever, whether it's, some representative of the UN, whether it's some John Kerry or something, has a stake in what happens with the climate. So ExxonMobil, we're going to score you in terms of your ability to have your assets managed and moved and to be able to do business at the highest levels in accordance to whether your environmental score is good. And we have to be socially responsible. We can't keep using capitalist methods to generate large-scale social and economic inequities. So we have to implement a social responsibility score under the social metric. And if you want to know how to do best practices under this new system, the stakeholder system, you're going to have best practices in company governance. And so that's the governance score. And so the way that it happened was people largely thinking, most of them involved probably thought they were doing something good. And maybe all of them did. I don't even necessarily want to say, oh, Klaus Schwab, evil. Maybe he is. Maybe he is. I don't know. I'm not going to just point at somebody and say evil for sure. What I'm going to say is, even if it started out good, it's a ball that is rolled down the hill to the point now where it's actually causing problems and nobody's willing to back out. It got out of control because power corrupts over time, as it tends to do. And most of this power being that it was done through non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in conjunction with state leaders and corporate leaders, is unaccountable power. I can't get pissed off and go vote Klaus Schwab out of the World Economic Forum. It's his entity. I don't know if it's a nonprofit, whatever it is. It's his entity. I can't vote him out. I have no accountability there. I can't cast my vote for George Soros not to fund the African American Policy Forum, which is dumping critical race theory into society at an alarming rate. I have no say over where George Soros throws his money.
Is he funding that?
Yes, he is the chief funder of the African American Policy Forum, which is run by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is who is the person who named critical race theory in 1989 in the first place.
I don't know why this makes me laugh.
It turns out you don't need very many people if they come up with a way to get a whole bunch of other people thinking they're doing the right thing while you're actually leading them around by the nose. You just don't need very many people. And they don't even have to be coordinating. George Soros can have his agenda with all of his money and be leading people in a particular direction. And Klaus Schwab or Christine Lagarde at the International Monetary Fund can be doing, and they're in cahoots for sure. I mean, they openly introduce each other and cite each other and appear together frequently. They can have their own agenda, and those might run kind of in parallel. They might feed off of each other. They might sometimes support each other. They might sometimes partner and sometimes not. The Koch brothers, there's only one left, dip in and out of this. For example, sometimes they're in it and sometimes they're not. So it doesn't take very many people to start creating a situation where lots of money and lots of opportunity, and I think the opportunity is bigger than the money. For example, what is the World Economic Forum? It's an opportunity. What is Davos? What is that meeting in Davos? It's a place for all the biggest movers and shakers in the world to get specially invited to come to this super cool thing. It's going to be lavish and exciting and fun and, whatever, and rub elbows and network with one another. Networks are really the thing of the 21st century, or at least for the time being. And being given access to rub elbows with other super smart and powerful people, as long as you kind of play by the overarching rules that get you in the room in the first place, creates an incredible pressure to get people to go along with something that it sounds exciting and new and good and fun. And you need very few people, if any, who are actually genuinely evil or agenda driven to really set the tone. The person who's inviting you,
do you need anybody evil there, or could this all be a bunch of influential people that are trying to do good and just?
It could be that. Yeah, it could actually be that. And then you can imagine, though, that if there are any evil people present at all, then that's going to be the thing. But it becomes a country club like It's like the country club, like Davos is that the Davos set is like the country club of country clubs of country clubs. It's the who's who, and I'm important and I'm big and special, or it has been for many, many years. And so all of a sudden you can create within a country club, you always end up creating an echo chamber, especially of values of what those people espouse, what they see in the world, what they want to do. And you can just very easily imagine where there's no Pied Piper necessarily. This is actually a thing in psychology that's known as the Abilene paradox, where everybody thinks that everybody else wants to go in a particular direction, but nobody necessarily does. So they all just kind of walk together. You can imagine, like, if you and a bunch of friends, nobody really wanted to go to Taco Bell, but somehow it was like, are we going to Taco Bell? And yeah, I thought we were. Oh, and nobody wants to be the one to speak up and say, what? No. And so all of a sudden, 4 or 5 of you are at Taco Bell at 2 a.m, and you're like, how did we get here? Like, everybody's privately thinking, how did we get here? But it's probably Waffle House at 2 a.m. But, nobody actually wanted to go, but everybody went. So there doesn't necessarily have to be a Pied Piper, but you can imagine how much worse it is if there is a Pied Piper. If, say, Klaus Schwab has this weird agenda and he says, well, the people I'm going to invite to this hyper elite special thing are people who I can get to go along with my agenda. And if they stop, I won't invite them anymore, or I'll cut them off at the knees in some other way, or I'll mobilize the group to excommunicate them. You create the exact kinds of social pressures that human beings are susceptible to at the most tribal level. And you can create a cabal around an agenda very easily. The conspiracy might be literally one person, and everybody else is just going along because they want to stay in the social club.
That would be crazy. It's just an entire pyramid, one person at the top.
Yeah, I encourage people to read Klaus Schwab's books. They're not hard to read. He is we'll say, visionary with our tongue planted firmly in our cheek. He's had a very clear vision for the world through a fourth industrial revolution, which is his kind of big points are a fourth industrial revolution, in which we are going to move away from a labor-based economy more or less entirely. Everything will be automated. And the problem that they're then trying to solve is this creates a many billion strong useless class to be compared against the creative class that gets to do the creative and fun things while machines do the vast majority of the work. So what do you do with those people? Well, you need methods of social control and management because they have nothing to work for. How do you justify paying them? Well, we need universal basic income, blah, 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 blah. That's a thing. So you have the idea of a fourth industrial revolution. He has this idea of a public-private partnership that's running a stakeholder or an impact capitalism. And that's where you end up with your ESG stuff. Now you have stakeholders who are going to judge how corporations are going to do things. We're going to reinvent capitalism to be run through this kind of technocratic means, through these, unelected experts in some kind of a stakeholder meeting, rather than through shareholders who actually have skin in the game in terms of what the company is doing in terms of making a success or not. He has another idea that what we're going to go toward in terms of sustainability is what he calls a circular economy. This has been warned about by leftists since the 1960s, and specifically the neo-Marxists in the 1960s, were warning that consumer capitalism, it said, meets people's needs. They were admitting that capitalism works once you control for trusts of certain kinds. So if you control for trust, capitalism meets people's needs. And they said, well, what happens is if you meet people's basic needs, they get new needs. And those needs become less and less needy in some sense. And so then you create an arbitrary kind of false economy that's just people producing stuff people don't need, so that people can buy stuff that they don't really want. And then if we look at that as a level of false needs, then there's this just continues and continues and continues until finally the entire thing becomes unsustainable. We exhaust the world of its resources, or we exhaust people completely, and they are unaware that capitalism is on an unsustainable growth course. So I would say, as somebody who studied mathematical epidemiology and mathematical ecology when I was in graduate school, that they don't understand how carrying capacities actually affect real populations, and that these things actually do have a nice natural smooth curve. The curves are almost always sigmoid in shape, and that these kinds of population dynamics are not actually unmanageable exponential catastrophes where everything destroys itself in the end. Populations tend not actually to destroy themselves by overpopulation, unless maybe you're talking about bacteria or something that has absolutely no capacity to cognate. So he wants to move into a circular economy rather than a linear or exponential economy. So everything, reduce, reuse, recycle, everything that comes out of the economy has to feed back in as the next cycle. But because of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy always increases. That's not really going to work. This is a program of managed decline. And if, again, you read, say, One-Dimensional Man, Herbert Marcuse, the kind of big critical theorist of the 60s, in One-Dimensional Man, he even talks about how, and this was written in 1964, the sustainable future requires, he says, of course, it requires a reduction in the future population because we have too many people and it's unsustainable. And you see these things running away. So now what we have to do is just kind of this managed decline where he says we're going to be content with less gadgets, less plastic. These are actual things he says, and that we have to find where our quality of life can be raised in other ways rather than having consumer capitalism drive everything off of a cliff. And so in that regard, I actually think it's driven, whether these people are evil or not is fine, whatever, that's a strong word, but it's driven by lunatics who don't understand how the world works, and that they're very afraid that we're either with the climate or with whatever else going to create an unsustainable situation that leads to mass extinction. And they're trying to save the world from that. So again, we come back to this pretext of safety. But what are we trading? Have you been to China? It's an interesting country. I've been to China I've spent 14 weeks of my life in China, and I would not want to live there. It's interesting to visit. But the social credit thing is intense.
Okay, James.
Sorry, I scared the crap out of you probably.
My arms are shaking. You just can't see it on camera.
Yeah. This is the moment where everything is meant to be reorganized, and everything is meant to be reorganized into one where social control is absolutely necessary, whether that's control of information, which they just call misinformation or whatever, through censorship, or what Marcuse warned us is the need for pre-censorship, lest the idea even enter the head of people who might be reactionary to what's going on with for him, the left agenda, the new left agenda. Whether it's in terms of, who did you hang out with? Who did you spend time with? How do you behave? Whatever. Did you decide that you were, what? It's Friday night. I ain't got nothing to do tomorrow. I'm going to have a good evening, and party it up or whatever. Well, that was irresponsible. Now you can't buy a plane ticket for 3 weeks or whatever. There's also an element of this where there's the gigantic intercontinental competition. There are people who in the West who are very afraid that the Chinese model is more efficient and successful, what we would call Dengism if we were.
Trudeau.
Well, yeah, Trudeau
has full on said that.
Yes, exactly. And you hear it from other Western leaders as well. So the model that China uses is called Dengism. It is a public-private partnership where they've opened up capital. It was pioneered. Deng is Deng Xiaoping. It was pioneered by Deng Xiaoping. And the idea was that we're going to open up the markets, but the market is going to operate at the pleasure of the party. So Jack Ma can become a billionaire and do crazy things and launch his the world's biggest new IPO. But he said something critical of the Chinese party while he was launching it. And all of a sudden his IPO doesn't get launched and he disappears for several months. When he comes back, nobody knows if he's dead, but when he finally comes back, he's not a billionaire anymore. He's not really all that rich because he said the wrong thing because he went against the party. So what you're actually seeing there, when they're looking over at China, if you want to put it in the terms of 1984, they see that East Asia already exists, but we don't have Oceania to go up against it. So they have to create Oceania on this side so that it can always be at war with East Asia. So in other words, they're looking at how do we turn the West into they're saying basically that freedom and democracy and republics are too inefficient to compete with an autocracy that has an open market. And so how do we create our own autocracy that can move and react as quickly and responsively to things as, say, the Chinese government can, while not being China. And so everybody's looking at the world and they don't understand, for example, that China just named George Soros a terrorist, and George Soros has probably done some things to strike back. And I won't speculate too deeply on what those things are, but it was weird that it was soon after that their housing market took a gigantic multi-trillion-dollar hit. and which is a very George Soros kind of thing to do.
How do you sleep at night? Do you sleep?
You get really tired and then you just black out and have bad dreams.
Okay, James, where can people find you online?
The website's newdiscourses.com. I don't actually talk about this side of stuff nearly as much as I do just about the woke stuff, because it turns out the woke is the lockpick to make this stuff work. It's like to open the door so we can do all this crap. So I mostly talk about the woke stuff. Also, that's where my literature reading is all. But that's all on newdiscourses.com. It's on social media in a lot of places at New Discourses. Go look. You can find it probably at whatever social media place you like, unless it's one of the ones that I don't want to deal with yet. And eventually I'll expand probably by force. I'm personally on Twitter at Conceptual James, and I'm very irreverent and I tweet way too much. And welcome to the jungle if you sign up for following me on Twitter. It's fun.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah. Sorry to scare the living shit out of you.
This episode is brought to you by the best grill I have ever used, hands down, no questions asked. As you know, Mom, Dad, and I are on this beef and lamb diet for our really awful autoimmune disorders. So we're very experienced at cooking meat. Very. But I've never done it with a grill this classy. Schwank Grills. You guys may have thought I'd switched brands from Blazing Bull to Schwank, but Schwank is Blazing Bull's new name. I don't do continuity errors. Schwank grills are made in America. They're portable. They're an infrared grill that heats up to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit to give you that premium steakhouse quality taste. You know when there's a crispy layer on the outside while still being rare or medium rare on the inside? Maillard reactions. This grill does that, but in your backyard or on your patio. Doesn't smoke. It's super easy to clean, which is amazing. And it makes high quality steakhouse style steaks or whatever else you feel like grilling. Steaks take around 3 minutes to grill, depending on the thickness. 3 minutes for a restaurant style steak. But you can also do chicken wings, fish, hamburgers, vegetables, or you can use the pizza stone if you're one of them pizza eaters for a nice crispy pizza in under 5 minutes. Try their special offer by heading to schwankgrills.com right now for $150 off a Schwank 1,500 degree grill when using promo code MP at checkout. For the code to work, you must have the Schwank grill and grill cover in your cart. That'll get you $150 off. Schwank grills with code MP at checkout. This episode is brought to you by Paleo Valley 100% grass-fed beef sticks. Paleo Valley is unique among protein products in the US. They're committed to making high-quality, clean products free of problematic ingredients and free from farming practices that are harmful to the environment. You've probably heard some of the tricks used by companies. Did you know that they can claim their beef is grass-fed as long as it was fed grass at one point in its life? Learn something new every day. Or that meat can be marked American-made even if it's only packaged in America. Paleo Valley, on the other hand, is the real deal. Their products come from small family-owned farms in the US that use rotational grazing. Look it up. I'm a huge fan of rotational grazing. And their cows are never fed grains or harmful antibiotics. So if you avoid meat for environmental reasons, which is not a good reason to avoid meat, but if you do, you're going to love these guys. Paleo Valley grass-fed and finished beef sticks. I can't quite eat these because of my strict meat and salt diet, but the ingredients in here are amazing. There are no preservatives or fillers, just 100% American, 100% grass-fed and finished beef from domestic regenerative farms and organic spices. Good luck finding anything this good. If you're trying to get healthy or lose weight, an easy way to do that is just to swap your snacks. I really recommend doing that. Get rid of the chips and cookies in your house and fill your house with Paleo Valley's beef sticks. Go ahead and help your body, U.S. farms, and the environment today by trying Paleo Valley's high-quality protein. Just head to paleovalley.com and enter code MP for 15% off your first order. That's paleovalley.com with code MP for 15% off your first order. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
Arthur Caplan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get started, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
Absolutely. So I'm a professor. I've been at NYU in New York City at our medical school for about 10 years now. And I started our program in medical ethics, bioethics. And often people are saying, that's nice. what's that? So what we do is we teach ethics courses to our medical students that are required. They learn about informed consent, privacy, the right to refuse medical treatments, how to share data, what's permissible, what isn't, what they have to report to public health authorities in terms of child abuse or sadly crimes, gunshot victims, that sort of stuff. And we get into issues of rationing healthcare. I think, Mikhaila, there's been a lot of rationing going on because of COVID, of different types of ICU beds and medical resources. We try to teach about how to think about that. We're interested in assisted suicide, which has been a big issue in the United States and Canada. When could you ever ask a doctor to help a dying person die? And could that happen to a child or someone who's mentally disabled? Could they participate in these kinds of things? And we do a lot of research. Sorry to babble on about this, but it just might interest listeners. So we study things like transplants. How well do people understand organ donation? When someone says, do you want to be an organ donor? Do they really, the family, understand what's happening? Are they satisfied that they were treated well? So we'll do surveys, questionnaires, interviews. We have a big project going, this is kind of interesting, on reproductive technologies. For example, I don't know if you know or your listeners know, but it's possible to take sperm from a dead body. Sometimes people, partners, wives will say, my husband, who was healthy, had a terrible heart attack out of the blue or had a stroke, and I still want to have his baby. And we can technologically remove sperm, but should we? That man who died never said, I want to have a baby when I'm dead. There's no permission, if you will. You listen to the wife or the girlfriend and they say, well, we really were trying to have a baby.
Yeah.
And, trust us. That's what we want to do. And you're thinking, do you take that seriously? So anyway, we're trying to survey both the medical people who do it, people who come in for in vitro fertilization treatment. We're just asking them as a kind of representative group, is this something you would know about, think about, ever do? So without taking up the whole podcast, we have a lot of fun, interesting, exciting areas that we study and publish about. And we also have a master's degree. You can take a master's degree in bioethics now at NYU.
Wow. Okay. I might have to have you back on to do a longer podcast. That sounds fascinating.
A lot of interesting stuff there.
Okay. So I wanted to talk on this episode specifically about the vaccine passport issue and the ethics behind that. So my first question here is this vaccine, the introduction of a vaccine passport. How do you feel about that ethically?
Well, you're talking to somebody who's been pro-vaccine passports for a while now. I didn't get to this late. Early on, I started to say, look, you're going to need to have some way to prove you're vaccinated if we're going to have freedom to travel. So the biggest reason to get a vaccine passport going is many countries are saying you can't come in here unless you're vaccinated. I'm not going to say whether they're right or wrong. It's just how it is. So if you want to visit Greece, if you want to go to, just many countries, they're going to say, show me proof of vaccination. Now, the way we're stuck doing it in the United States is you pull out these little paper cards that you get when you get vaccinated. They're not even laminated. I mean, they weren't even meant for this purpose. So I think you need to have something that you can stick on your passport card or some chip or something that says, I'm vaccinated. Remember, too many businesses, they do international commerce, big companies, they got to send their salespeople or their workforce or their IT people all around the world. A lot of the world is saying you can't come here. By the way, that's true in the US. We're saying you can't enter and you can't also immigrate unless you have proof of vaccination. So we're looking for it as well. So better to have a standardized card, hard to forge, something you can't counterfeit, just for international purposes. That's probably the strongest argument.
What about people who don't want to get vaccinated?
Look, I'm never going to make anybody get vaccinated. You don't have to do it. I'm not sending out the vaccine police to hold you down and sort of give you a vaccine while you scream that you don't want it. But what happens with people who don't want to vaccinate, and this is odd, they lose some of their freedom. I think we hear a lot of debate saying, I have to be free to decide whether or not to vaccinate. I wouldn't disagree. It is your body. You can decide what you want to put in there. But if the business says you can't come in without vaccination, let's say your gym or your restaurant or whatever it is, or your employer says, look, you're not working here without vaccination. And by the way, employers are free to do that. They think about having a job. They can fire you for 1,000 reasons out of the blue. It's what we call at will. You know, you're employed unless you have a contract or some special arrangement. You work at the discretion of the company. If the company decides for whatever reason you got to be vaccinated, then you can't go there. So what I'm saying is this. Well, we sometimes argue ethically, we have to be free to choose. Okay. But remember, you're going to have more freedom to work and go places in a world that's starting to expect vaccination in a lot of settings. You can make the choice, say, I don't care, then I won't work there. And I'm not going to go into those places that want me to prove it. Okay. But I think weirdly, it's pretty likely that you're going to get more freedom long-term from vaccinating than not.
Okay. What about the concern, whether or not this is a conspiracy theory, who knows, but what about the concern that the vaccine passport is part of a bigger picture and we'll end up with a social credit system like China?
Yeah. Well, the Chinese system, for listeners don't know, they're using face recognition. They're monitoring movements all over the place. By the way, they also test your genes. They have all this genetic database on who's a Uyghur and who's not. And part of the way they lock up people they don't like is to use a genetic test. So another show, that's really abusive of human rights. They're monitoring their citizens day and night. If we had a vaccine passport, are we sliding down that road is basically the worry. I don't think so, because I think we can say in the middle of a plague, we need these vaccine passports. When the plague goes away, we're done with them. That is, we're not going to do them anymore. But we should pass legislation that makes it clear we're responding to COVID. This is not an effort to let the state start to know where we are. The other sad point is this, and it is sad. I'm holding up right now my cell phone, and people constantly are saying to me, I don't want a vaccine passport because people will know where I am. You know what this cell phone does? It transmits every minute where I am to a slew of people, not just hackers, but my credit card company, my bank. Somebody does open table and makes reservations at restaurants. They know where I am all the time. This thing is a GPS. It tracks me constantly. I would worry about that area of privacy more. I mean, I'm on board to say we got to protect your privacy, but the vaccine passport is like a 1% risk relative to your credit card, your cell phone, your Uber registration, what Facebook knows about you. I mean, my God, there's 100 different companies right now that know everything about me, where I look on the web, where I go, and we haven't done anything about that.
Are you aware of, so you're in New York. What's New York like if you're not vaccinated and you don't have one of these cards?
Nasty. This is a place that's very pro-vaccine, as I am, to be honest. I've been vaccinated. I've even had a third shot. I just got my flu shot. You're talking to someone.
Did you get the booster shot after the first two, like after 6 months or something?
Yes.
Okay.
Partly just because I'm old enough to qualify. That's really why I did it. Partly because I do go to places where there are unvaccinated people around, just in a lot of my job-related work in the hospital and stuff. And then whether it's a wedding or a sporting event, I don't know who's really vaccinated or not. People say they are. I don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So I'm being cautious that way. All that said, New York has mandates, and they are they're seriously applied. I would say a lot of restaurants, bars, gyms, cafes, you can't get in unless you can show a vaccine passport, unless you have authentication. They won't serve you and they won't let you in. There have been fights about it. People have gotten into big screaming arguments about getting in, but they do try to enforce a citywide mandate on access to public places. Teachers mandated, city workers mandated. They're talking now about mandating vaccination for prison guards and the police. The mayor's on here constantly promoting vaccination. But the real test of this, I mean, what are we trying to do? We're not just trying to vaccinate people, we're trying to get less disease and, where I work, less people in the hospital. So I see the results of non-vaccination because our beds are full when the epidemic is out of control. A lot of people sick, a lot of people dying, pressure on the ICU beds that we have and around the New York hospitals. Right now, Alaska, for example, is in the middle of a huge outbreak, and they don't have enough ICU beds and they don't have enough doctors to treat all the people coming in. So it's bad. The mandates here have reduced that. The real question to me is, I don't care what the vaccination rate is. What I want to know is, are there fewer people getting sick? So far it looks like our rates are probably 80% vaccination, and I think it's having an impact. Even the US, 70% roughly vaccinated at this point of adults. Kids are going to be, we'll see what happens with them soon, but they're going to become eligible. But COVID is starting to get weaker. Fewer cases, fewer deaths. I think it's working.
What do you think of the ethics behind not pressuring people to be vaccinated with a newer vaccine like this, especially kids?
That's a really good question. So a lot of people worry. These are new vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna. The Johnson & Johnson one is a little older style vaccine that's been around a little more. That's the 2-shot one. But the new, a lot of people are offered Pfizer and Moderna. And it is true that the description that was used by then President Trump for them was warp speed. And I think a lot of people are thinking, I'm not sure I want my medicine at warp speed or my vaccine at warp speed. So here's what's gone on. I'll give you the story. The vaccines Moderna and Pfizer had are not warp speed science. You got Canada had a big SARS outbreak.
Yeah.
There were MERS outbreaks, different diseases. They're all cousins to COVID. They're all in that same, what's called the SARS family of viruses. And they were working on these platforms to make vaccines for about 10 years. They'd already done the animal studies. They tested the same technology in healthy volunteers. That's why you were able to go fast. If we hadn't been doing that, there wouldn't have been any vaccines to approve because they would have had to start from scratch and start animal studies and all this. So they've done all that. What's warp speed is the US government said, we're going to buy vaccines from you big pharma companies, whether they work or not. You're going to get paid. Big pharma company said, hey, great. You give us billions of dollars. We'll make a lot of these vaccines. That's the warp speed. It's the manufacturing. Normally it would take them forever, years to commit to making a lot of vaccine. Now they said, you're giving us the money, whether it works or not, we're in. Happily, they worked. But the speedy part is making them faster. Do the companies make money? They did. Is there a potential to say they have a conflict of interest in promoting vaccination? Yeah, you could. Although I do think we're getting a demonstration as COVID begins to dip that they're working. Did the companies get overpaid? I think so. Should they start to be cutting the price? I think so. Should they be doing something to make vaccines available in poor countries? I think so. They're not. So I'm not excusing their behavior, but I don't worry about the science. I think the science is sound. And, at this point, one other comment, a couple of billion people have had vaccination around the world. If it was really dangerous, we'd know.
Okay, so you talked about vaccine passports and what would be potentially reasonable would be implementing the passport while we're in the middle of a pandemic. and then having some of these rights back potentially for, and correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrong, but having some of these rights back maybe for unvaccinated people once numbers are lower.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I think, look, we have the flu. In any given year, it might kill as many as 25, 30,000 people in the US. I don't know the worldwide numbers, but it's not trivial. But no one's getting a passport. No one's saying you can't come in here if you're not vaccinated against the flu. There are days when I think maybe we should do that just to get more flu protection. But look, all of us have to come to an agreement. I'm going to use a US number again. 725,000 people dead in a year is too big. Got to get tough. Got to try and control that. 25,000 people dying is a little bit more like automobiles. And we don't ban them. We just kind of try to make it safer. I'm not saying we don't do anything, but we live with the fact that a lot of people die in car accidents, and that's how it is. And that's what we do with the flu. If we could drive COVID down to that level, then I think we're kind of out of the woods, and we don't have to have special laws and mandates and religious exemptions and all these fights we're getting into. It's that big number, close to 750,000 people dead, a hospital system around the world that's been hugely strained, very expensive. Think about the economic impact. We tried to do quarantines and lockdowns in many countries like New Zealand, Australia. The world economy almost fell apart. That's a much bigger problem that makes me want to do a bigger response, if you will, to have vaccine passports and pro-vaccination. It's the numbers.
What happened? So you think that the vaccines are helping? I feel like, and I'm not aware of the numbers. I thought in Canada, and I could be wrong, but I thought that the numbers were rising again. And I think we have about an 80% vaccination rate. But so should we be looking at numbers, or should we be looking at how severe the disease is?
So in the US, 40% reduction in hospitalizations in the past couple of weeks, and many fewer cases, although we don't really have a national testing program. So it's a little hard to say, are there fewer infected people? We're basically tracing, to answer your question, symptoms, who sick enough to get to the hospital, because that's where we have numbers. So that is the measure.
Okay, and there's been a reduction in the last couple of weeks. Yeah,
it's really shifting. You see it. And by the way, I'm going to confess to something else. There's a lot of vaccination out there, but something else has happened. There are also a lot of people who got COVID and have some natural immunity.
Yeah.
So
I had COVID twice.
Did you?
Yeah, it was fairly unpleasant.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happened? What was your experience?
The first time I was sick for about 2.5 weeks, but it was really not that bad. I had a fever off and on, and it really wasn't that bad. I have a toddler, so I get some of the horrible things she drags home.
Yeah, sure. And they're little agents of infection.
Yeah, gross. But anyway, so the first time it wasn't that bad. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to be immune for a while. And then I got it again about a year later, and it was quite nasty. It was about 2 weeks, so it didn't last for as long. But I had a wheeze. I didn't end up in the hospital. I wasn't taking any medication or anything, but I was completely wiped out. And I still don't have my sense of smell or taste back. And I had it in June.
So one other reason to worry about COVID, as you think about vaccination versus, and whatever the risks and worries are about that versus COVID, my wife got it too. And she was infected before we had vaccines. She runs a huge hospital here in New York, the Bronx VA. She went to work every day. Pre-vaccination, she was around plenty of people who were infected. She got it, hasn't had her full sense of smell and taste restored. Even now, it's been over
How
a
long?
year.
No, it's not what I want to hear.
She tires easily. I think we don't understand yet what this damn virus does long-term to the people who get it. I'm not saying it's the same for everybody. She's older than you, so maybe younger people do better. But you know this. People have underlying diseases. They're more prone to get complications. I worry that COVID infection might trigger bad responses in someone with MS or diabetes or other things. We don't know. We just don't know. So that could be an additional reason to go for the vaccine, even if you're like, oh, I don't know, I don't like vaccines. You don't want to get stuck with this long-term COVID problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some of the arguments you hear on the other side are questions about the efficacy of the vaccine. So whether or not it's actually helping, because say in Canada, well, what percentage of the people in hospitals that end up in hospitals are vaccinated? Is this actually reducing the severity of symptoms? Are we sure about that?
Yeah, we're sure. That, if you look, I'm in Connecticut where I live. Here's the number. In the ICU, unvaccinated people are there at a frequency of 50 times vaccinated people.
Wow.
So it's huge. You're not going to get in the ICU if you vaccinate. I'm not saying you wouldn't get some symptoms. I'm not saying people can't catch it. But it makes you less sick. By the way, you know something interesting? That's exactly what the flu vaccine does. People say to me all the time, I got vaccinated, I got the flu. And I say to them, so how long were you sick? And they say, I don't know, a day. Most people get the flu, are out of it for 5 days. They're bedridden. They got aches and pains. It's miserable. Yeah, you could still get the flu, but part of what these vaccines are doing is if the body's immune system can't be bumped up enough to fight off completely the virus, it still helps to diminish the symptoms. So that's one for the vaccines there, I think. But yeah, we really do know the numbers there because we can survey who's in the ICU. We know.
Should there be exemptions for people who have natural immunity? And is natural immunity more effective at fighting COVID than the vaccine?
Yeah. Well, here's something bananas. The same mechanisms of natural immunity are what you get out of a vaccine. They're operating the same way. It's not like natural for immunity is better than vaccine immunity. It's not like that's unnatural. You're using the same cells to try and get an immune response. It's weirdly vaccines.
So like I said, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I thought that the vaccine worked and it only provoked part of an immune response compared to contracting COVID. Is that wrong?
So I know what you're asking there. So when you get the disease, you might trigger, let's say there are 5 parts of your immune system. There are T cells and B cells and all kinds of stuff that we don't have to get into here. And when you get sick, if you get a big exposure to COVID, you probably get them all triggered. If you only get a little exposure, you walk by somebody, a few viruses get into you, you're not setting that all off.
Oh.
If you get the vaccine, it does set off all of the immune responses. So the argument is you might have partial protection. In some instances, natural infection, true, but you're going to get the full ride if you take the vaccine because the way it's designed is to basically set off the whole immune response. So that's what the difference is. Are there people out there, maybe you, who had, serious exposure to COVID and twice, whose immune system is operating about the same level as a vaccine? Could be. There are other people, though, who they just get a sniffle. They don't even know they got infected. I don't think their immune system was triggered fully. They didn't have enough virus to set the whole thing off. So that's where the argument is. Are there people who probably don't need it? Yeah. But it's interesting, too. We're talking about third shots. Some people say, well, the vaccine isn't that good. If it needs a third shot, what the heck? Didn't work. I think it's a 3-shot vaccine. For listeners who've had any vaccines, if you get HPV vaccine for cervical cancer, which young women and boys do, it's 3 shots spaced out over a year and a half. If you get a vaccine for hepatitis, which is a great vaccine to get because you really don't want to damage your liver, spaced out 3 shots. Polio vaccine, which by the way isn't really a vaccine, it's an oral thing, but it's 4 things for kids over, 2 years. My point being, when we developed these vaccines, we were so desperate to get something that would stop deaths that they gave 1 shot, waited 2 weeks, and gave the second one. That's not enough. Maybe what we're just talking about is a 3-shot vaccine, which is one of the reasons I decided to get the 3rd shot. I don't even think of it as a booster. I think we were in such a hurry to get these things out there, and they worked. at least they stopped the initial wave of COVID. Okay, ethically, I agree. But it could be that we need 3 shots to make this thing work. And then we could argue about boosters. But if the 3 shots give you immunity for 3 years, 5 years, that's what you want. I don't know about you, but almost everybody has had a tetanus shot in their life. Even that needs a booster, 10 years.
Yeah. I think I was tested recently for, I can't remember. I think it was part of the MMR vaccine. One of them had worn off. Rubella,
yeah, they do. You normally don't worry about it because there's so little measles and mumps floating around that, when you get reminded about those, when you travel. If you went in and said, I'm going to go to Mozambique, or which I did a couple of years ago, I got a medical trip and a vacation lined up there. Every booster I must have had, this will terrify listeners, I think I had like 8 shots, typhus, typhoid, all kind of yellow fever, blah, 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 blah. It didn't worry me too much because those are pretty well established vaccines, but they were all basically boosters.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. Well, going to some of those places, I can understand why.
Yeah. Having been there, by the way, I fully understand why now. A lot of disease.
Yeah. Okay. You, I believe, wrote an article about people who were potentially people who refused to take the COVID-19 vaccine being held financially liable. Is that something you still believe?
Oh, yeah. I still do. And here's why. If you knew that your kid was COVID positive and you sent them to school and the people they sat next to, their kids got sick, you ought to be responsible for the decision not to keep them home, or, say, at least you got to go in with a mask, or maybe even notify the class that my kid's positive, but coming in anyway. So what I was talking about is people who deliberately know they're sick, but still go to work or still go to school. We have a law like that in the US. I'm not sure about Canada. If you know that you are HIV positive and you still have sex with somebody, you're liable if they get sick.
Are they trying to, I've heard somewhere that was trying to be appealed.
The AIDS thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it could be. There haven't been many prosecutions because the situation happily is rare. You got to be kind of a malignant idiot to do that. But it comes up a little bit too. We had a big trial here, the R. Kelly trial. Remember that? The guy. Yeah. So a lot of the women said he gave me herpes and he knew he was positive. And that became part of the lawsuit. So I'm in that spirit. That's what I'm talking about here. It's like, I'm not saying just anybody wandering around, but if you knew that you were sick and you went in and sat in a small office with somebody and they got sick and they sort of said, well, the only person that's positive that I've been around is you, that's where you might get some liability.
Do you think that the vaccine passport ethically, okay, so you're not allowed, and I think it's in the Constitution, but I could be wrong because I'm not American, but you're not allowed to ask for health data, right? That's your personal data. So do you think the vaccine passport crosses into that territory?
No. So we have a privacy law, HIPAA, that was passed in 1996. It actually was passed before Google. It's way out of date, by the way. But the only thing it applies to is what doctors and nurses and healthcare workers can release. It has no authority over what the state or the city can ask you for, or if you choose to give out health information anyway. So a doctor is told, you can't release records, you can't say anything about, Mikhaila's care, it's private, you need her permission. I mean, they could do it if you said, okay. There are plenty of people, Bill Clinton went in the hospital yesterday for some sort of infection. We're not going to know much about his care unless he says, you can tell people. That's what the law governs, doctors and hospitals. But there's no HIPAA protection if the mayor says you're going to have to show a passport to get into this restaurant. The law was never intended as a general privacy law. it was about medical records. By the way, paper records, I mean, that law is so old, it so badly needs updated. And we could argue about whether it should be extended wherever you go or what the police could demand and so on. But right now, it's a very narrow, misunderstood law. It applies to me. I'm not supposed to tell you if we had a celebrity patient that they're there in the hospital or, that somebody has been raped or had a mental illness or something like that. I don't know what the Canadian equivalent is. I just don't know.
I think it's probably something similar.
Yeah, but a lot of these privacy, what I'm saying is a lot of these privacy laws were enacted before you got a Fitbit and were sending health information off to a company. Are they prohibited from sharing that? No, they're not a doctor. They're not a hospital. I guess they could sell it. They could, call you up and say, I think you need to get a little more sleep there, Mikhaila. We're looking at your monitoring device. And we don't like what we're seeing. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, it's a free fire zone.
Are they trying to implement QR codes or anything in New York?
No, we have not seen that yet.
So everything's paper.
Everything's paper. And easy to counterfeit. And there are counterfeits going on out there. They've prosecuted a few people. I am told by some of my students that it would take you about 30 minutes to make a pretty good counterfeit of a COVID card. So, that's an issue.
Yeah. Okay. And then this is definitely an issue while traveling too. I was in Dubai and everyone's vaccinated. They did mass vaccination there. Everyone's vaccinated there, and you need a vaccine to get into the country. I think Israel was the same. Or did Israel backtrack on that? Did they mandate it and then backtrack?
They sort of rolled out vaccine in waves. So they tried to do the elderly. That wasn't enough. Then they started to do adults. Then they started to do kids. So they've had waves of vaccination.
Oh.
But they're pretty much up to the 100%. By the way, Dubai and the Emirates, they're an interesting case study because I don't think they've had much in the way of people in the hospital.
Yeah, they haven't. But they, when I was there, they said they just there was a stadium and people just went in and got vaccinated. You had to get vaccinated for your job, or they just kicked you out of Dubai. They're like, well, you don't have to work here.
Right. Yeah. And remember one other thing, in countries like Dubai or Israel, they are all part of a national health system. The issues about privacy are less worrisome to them because they already have all your medical information. It's run by the government. They can peek in and look at anything they damn well want. Israel too. So there's no divide between healthcare over here and government over there. Basically, the government's running the health system. The government pays for your healthcare, and they're looking all the time at what's going on in terms of cost and payment. And so if they want to, I'm sure they can look at anything they like about your health.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Do I have other questions for you? I don't think so. I think that kind of covers your view pretty well. I know you have a heart out. I might want to bring you back on to talk bioethics.
Well, look, one area we didn't talk about is what about alternative medicines and approaches to COVID? There's a lot out there.
Let's do that.
And I'm familiar with some things I hate because I don't think they really work, that there's not evidence, for example, that if you took ivermectin, this deworming pill, there's no reason to think that a pill that's aimed at killing worms is going to kill viruses. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I know there are a lot of people who swear by it. A lot of people say better, but scientifically, what kills worms doesn't kill viruses. And at least the published data that's out there doesn't really see any benefit from ivermectin. On the other hand, if somebody said to me, I want to use something to boost my immune system, personally, I think that's hard to do, but it doesn't hurt you. And if you want to do that, okay. I like alternative medicine things that I think are safe, so to speak, neutral. They don't make you sicker. Maybe some people feel they get benefit, and that's fine by me. If you want to do aromatherapy or you have massage or whatever, I mean, those sound nice. Are they going to kill viruses? I doubt it, but okay. So I think medicine can work with alternative approaches, alternative ideas, health foods, whatever. You just don't want to have people promoting certain drugs that are out there. Ivermectin is one of them. It is an approved drug, but it's for worm killing. It's like, that isn't where you want to go. The thing that helps your sheep or your cow is probably not the thing that's going to be right for you to battle COVID. And when a court says this patient wants it, my attitude is we don't give it because it's more dangerous than it is helpful.
What about antibody infusions?
They work. They absolutely do work. Problem with them, it's expensive. So you could go to them, and people are getting them. These are the things that basically are building in antibodies the way hopefully a vaccine or natural infection would produce them. You're just making them and putting them in, but they work. It's just they probably cost $20,000. You have to get them IV. It's a whole song and dance. I know some people seem to think that's better than getting a vaccine, but that's a trade-off I don't like. I'd rather get the vaccine than be sitting there in the clinic a couple of times to get antibody infusion. Well, in any event, if you let me out, I'm happy to come back and rant on.
Yeah, I'll let you out. Thank you very much for coming on here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.